By the time Judge Arun Subramanian stepped through the side door of the federal courtroom and took his seat, the tension was almost physical. It was not the casual anticipation of a routine hearing, but a tightly wound silence that came when everyone present understood they were about to witness a decision with irreversible weight. The gallery was full, reporters with open notebooks, defense lawyers adjusting papers in neat stacks, prosecutors reviewing their notes one final time. Even the sound of shifting in seats seemed amplified in the stillness. This was not just another procedural day in court. For Shawn "Diddy" Combs, this was the last real chance to step outside the walls of a detention center before his sentencing in the fall. For 11 months, Combs had been confined to the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, a facility known among lawyers and defendants for its harsh, overcrowded conditions and limited privileges. His days there had been far from the stage lights, photo shoots, and industry parties that had once defined his existence. The trial that brought him to this point had peeled back the carefully constructed public image of the music mogul, replacing it with testimony, evidence, and allegations that painted a starkly different picture. On the day the jury returned its verdict, the reaction had been mixed and complicated. Acquitted of racketeering conspiracy and 2 counts of sex trafficking, the most sensational charges, but convicted on 2 counts of violating the Mann Act, a law dating back more than a century that criminalizes the transportation of individuals across state lines for purposes of prostitution. Each count carried a maximum penalty of 10 years in prison. Legal analysts predicted a lower sentence, perhaps between 2 and 5 years. But prison time, they agreed, was almost certain. This hearing was not about determining that sentence. It was about whether Combs could be released before it was handed down. An extraordinary request under federal law, but one his attorneys believed they could justify. In the days leading up to the hearing, they filed a motion portraying his case as an exceptional circumstance, the type that could allow a judge to grant post-conviction release before sentencing. The motion argued that the conduct for which he was convicted was non-violent, involved only consenting adults, and was far removed from the kind of criminal enterprise the Mann Act had historically targeted. There has never been a prosecution like this one, the filing declared. It framed his convictions not as a danger to the community, but as an anomaly, the criminalization of a private lifestyle. The defense also reached into the history of the law itself. Enacted in 1910 as the White Slave Traffic Act, the Mann Act was a product of its time, an era gripped by moral panic over immorality and vice. It was passed decades before women could vote, and at a time when interracial relationships were widely stigmatized and often criminalized by states. Legal historians have documented how, in its early years, the statute was sometimes used less to combat coercion and exploitation than to punish relationships that offended the racial and sexual norms of the day. Over time, its scope narrowed. Modern prosecutions generally involve defendants who profited from organized prostitution or sex trafficking. In contemporary practice, cases involving only consensual adults were rare. To the defense, this was not just a legal argument, but a moral one. Applying the Mann Act to Combs's conduct was a misuse of a law with a fraught and discriminatory legacy. Prosecutors saw no such historical injustice. The statute's language was unambiguous, they argued, and its application to Combs's conduct was straightforward. The government's evidence, payment records, travel itineraries, text messages, showed that Combs had arranged and funded the interstate travel of individuals for sexual activity. The fact that all parties were adults and willing participants, they said, did not alter the legal reality. They reminded the court that the jury, after hearing weeks of testimony, had found these facts proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The convictions, they insisted, were valid and serious, and the circumstances did not meet the high bar for post-conviction release. Combs sat at the defense table in a dark, precisely tailored suit, a visual departure from the khaki uniform of detention, but still a man under heavy constraint. His posture was upright, his hands folded in front of him. He glanced periodically toward the benches where his family sat in the first 2 rows. Some of them clasped their hands tightly. Others stared ahead, their expressions unreadable. The defense lawyers, speaking with measured urgency, moved through their arguments. Combs had no record of fleeing from court proceedings. His global fame, they said, made him one of the least likely defendants to vanish. There was no corner of the world where he could go unnoticed. They emphasized that the jury had rejected the sex trafficking charges because there was no evidence of force, fraud, or coercion. The Mann Act convictions, they argued, were a technical application of an old statute, never intended for consensual arrangements like these. The prosecution's rebuttal was just as focused. Wealth and fame, they countered, could make it easier to flee, not harder. They reminded the judge of multiple prior bail denials, citing both the nature of the conduct and the need to maintain public trust in the justice system. The convictions, while not for violent crimes, were still federal offenses with real victims in the eyes of the law. Legal analysts outside the courthouse noted how much the acquittals had shifted the dynamics of the case. If this had been a straight sex trafficking conviction, this conversation wouldn't even be happening. One former prosecutor said, "But the Mann Act alone, without violence, that's unusual, especially for someone of his profile." That profile had been examined in detail during the trial. Jurors heard from witnesses who described freak-offs, as they were called in testimony. Sexual encounters involving multiple partners, often recorded for later viewing. The accounts were explicit, but the defense leaned on the fact that the witnesses described them as voluntary. Some of the same male escorts were invited multiple times over years. Jane Doe witnesses spoke of relationships that blended intimacy with performance, jealousy with indulgence. When Judge Subramanian finally delivered his decision, it was without drama. His words were measured. While the defense's points were noted, they did not rise to the level of exceptional reasons that federal law required for post-conviction release. The risks of flight, of undermining the public's confidence, outweighed the arguments for letting Combs walk free before sentencing. The ruling meant he would remain in custody at the Middle District Court until October. In the defense camp, the reaction was quiet but visible. Combs's shoulders stiffened. His lead attorney leaned close, speaking in low tones. Behind them, a family member pressed her hand to her mouth. The man at the center of it all kept his eyes forward, his expression unchanged, but the stillness seemed heavier now. Though the statutory maximum for the convictions was 20 years, no one in the room expected such a sentence. The real battle would be over whether the number was measured in years or months, and whether time already served would count toward it. Prosecutors were expected to seek a multi-year term. The defense was preparing to argue for as little as 21 to 27 months, with credit for the 11 months he had already spent in detention. The sentencing guidelines would weigh factors beyond the verdict, including Combs's lack of prior convictions for violent crimes, his history of community ties, and any mitigating testimony from family or associates. Within minutes of the decision, news alerts began flashing across phones. Judge denies Diddy's request for release ahead of sentencing. On social media, the divide was immediate and sharp. Supporters called it a miscarriage of justice, a technical conviction inflated into a moral judgment. Critics called it overdue accountability, pointing to years of rumors and allegations that had never before reached a courtroom. In the music industry, the conversation quickly turned to the wider implications. Combs was not just another artist. He was a producer, an executive, a gatekeeper. His conviction raised the possibility that others in his network might face scrutiny. It also raised a more existential question. If even Diddy could fall, who else might be vulnerable? Away from the cameras, the legal battles were far from over. Combs still faced an avalanche of civil litigation, at least 66 lawsuits alleging misconduct. Legal experts said the criminal verdict could have unpredictable effects on those cases. Plaintiffs who had testified and faced aggressive cross-examination might see their credibility diminished. Others, especially those whose allegations echoed the facts underlying the Mann Act convictions, could feel emboldened. Every single one of those cases now exists in the shadow of this verdict, a civil litigator observed. Some will settle quietly. Others will fight on. But all of them are now tied, in the public's mind and in court filings, to the fact that he's a convicted federal offender. When the hearing ended, there was no theatrical display. The judge left the bench. Court officers moved toward the defense table. Combs stood, straightening his jacket in what might have been the last purely voluntary gesture he would make for some time. His gaze moved to his family, then to the press benches, and finally to the side door through which he would leave. The sound of handcuffs locking shut was loud in the stillness. The marshals guided him toward the door. The gallery watched until it closed behind him. Outside, the crowd of reporters surged forward, microphones and cameras ready. Fans and critics pressed against barricades. Somewhere beyond the public areas of the courthouse, Combs began the short, controlled walk back to the MDC. In the world outside, his career, his legacy, and his place in the industry were already being redefined. Inside, the reality was simpler. He was an inmate awaiting a sentence, and the reckoning, in many ways, had already begun.